The castle breathed with shadows, each stone wall steeped in centuries of whispered secrets. Torches flickered along narrow corridors, casting erratic light that danced across cold, damp floors. A metallic tang hung in the air, a mingling of fear, sweat, and the faint copper scent of blood from past transgressions. From the depths of a secluded chamber, muffled moans and whispered incantations seeped into the halls, a haunting symphony of pleasure and pain, hidden from the eyes of God and man alike. Inside, nobles and servants alike moved with a delicate choreography, careful to conceal acts deemed sinful by the church while succumbing to desires that society could not name. Velvet curtains rustled against skin, chains and silk intertwined. Every sigh, every brush of hand against flesh was a negotiation between coercion and consent. The audiences brought into the perspective of the victims, the terrified servants, the coerced apprentices, the young nobles caught between obedience and carnal curiosity. Their bodies were stages upon which power, greed, and lust performed acts of ritual and indulgence, each participant both predator and prey in a world built on secrecy. The scent of burning incense mingled with the musk of unwashed bodies, and the low murmur of incantations seemed to pulse through the stone walls, as if the castle itself were alive and complicit. Shadows clung to corners, hiding observers, and the faint scuff of footsteps echoed like distant drums of anticipation. Pleasure became a weapon, desire a trap, and morality a distant, unattainable ideal. Within this dark theatre, even the architecture seemed designed to entrap. Narrow corridors that forced proximity, high ceilings that amplified every whispered command, hidden stairways that carried secrets from chamber to chamber. Every glance was surveilled, every act weighed, and every participant understood, whether consciously or not, the precarious balance of power and vulnerability. By the time dawn threatened to spill pale light into the castle, the participants had vanished like phantoms, leaving behind only the lingering scent of fear and ecstasy. The midnight chamber, hidden in plain sight, would remain a witness to these forbidden acts, a symbol of the human capacity for both indulgence and cruelty. History would remember little, but the echoes of those nights endured, etched into stone, and memory alike, shaping dynasties and corrupting innocence in ways no chronicle could fully contain. The chamber was dim, filled with the mingling scents of wax, damp stone, and the faint coppery tang of blood from past punishments. Adolescents shuffled nervously, their garments whispering against skin, eyes darting at every shadow. In noble courts and convents, sexual knowledge was no tender lesson. It was imposed through coercion, manipulation, and fear. Tutors, chambermaids, and even relatives became instructors in a curriculum that masked abuse as moral instruction, shaping bodies and minds alike for dynastic ends. A boy flinched as a tutor demonstrated acts meant to instruct, his young body trembling, cheeks slick with tears he dare not shed. Nearby, a girl recoiled at the brush of silk against her skin, simultaneously a lesson and a threat. Observation was mandatory, consent meaningless. Every whispered command weighed heavy with religious authority and social survival. Fear was the teacher, shame the lesson. The psychological trauma is relentless. Walls intended for protection became prisons. Corridors once safe became paths of exposure. Each adolescent learned that survival demanded compliance, cunning, and the suppression of instinct. Candlelight flickered across terrified faces, the scrape of slippered feet against stone echoing like distant threats. Sweat, incense, and the underlying stench of fear filled the air, imprinting trauma in every breath. By chapter's close, innocence had fractured. Children were no longer merely observers. They became participants in the twisted interplay of desire, power, and control. Knowledge was weaponized, pleasure was coercion, and survival required navigating a labyrinth where morality, duty, and cruelty were inseparable. The shadow of this early education would stretch across lifetimes, shaping both victims and the society that permitted such horrors. Torchlight flickered against the courtyard stones as masked nobles moved in precise, ritualized patterns, their laughter and whispers mingling with the scent of incense and sweat. Ceremony and indulgence intertwined. Eroticism was cloaked in devotion, sin hidden behind ritual. Those gathered were caught in a web of power, obligation, and desire. Every gesture, glance, and whispered word carried consequences for status, reputation, and survival. A young acolyte, trembling and exposed, became a pawn in the spectacle. Silk brushed against her skin, fingers traced patterns meant to teach obedience as much as pleasure. Consent was an illusion, observation a weapon. Faith and indulgence collided, leaving terror and fascination inseparable. The audience, both participants and observers, felt the oppressive tension. Desire measured against the fear of transgression, devotion against the threat of disgrace. The climax came when a victim was ritually humiliated before the gathered nobles. Candlelight illuminated tear-streaked faces, exposed limbs trembling under the weight of authority. The act was both punishment and display, a lesson in dominance, ritualized cruelty, and the intersection of power and carnal indulgence. Every motion and sound amplified psychological torment, leaving an indelible mark on mind and memory. In the aftermath, the consequences became clear. Alliances shifted, reputations fractured, and trauma lingered long after the masks were removed. The altar of desire was more than a place. It was a stage on which power, sin, and survival collided. These acts, though hidden from most records, shaped dynasties, reinforced hierarchies, and left psychological scars that generations would inherit. A silent testament to the dark intersection of ritual, sexuality, and ambition. Damp stone walls dripped cold moisture, seeping into the bones of those confined. Iron chains clinked softly as victims shifted in narrow cells, their bodies restrained and their spirits weighed down by fear. Noble, clerical, or common, those coerced into sexual servitude found themselves trapped in castles, monasteries, and wealthy households where walls became instruments of control and every corridor held threat. Promises of protection masked coercion, threats of excommunication enforced compliance. A young woman traced the rough patterns of moss along the stone floor, her fingers trembling as she calculated escape routes that may never exist. Footsteps echoed, the hiss of torches punctuating the silence, each sound a potential signal of judgment or punishment. Chains bound more than wrists. They confined minds, bending obedience and terror into a single, oppressive weight. The climax arrived with a desperate attempt at freedom. Crawling through slick passageways, heart pounding, the prisoner encountered a shadowed enforcer. Her screams ricocheted off stone, mingling with the anguish of others who had surrendered to despair. The harrowing scene revealed the intertwined physical and psychological cruelty of captivity, the limits of endurance, and the resilience of those forced into unimaginable circumstances. In the aftermath, survivors carried the invisible chains of trauma even when released or married off to secure dynastic alliances. Fear, shame, and subjugation shaped behavior, alliances, and politics. Power and ambition overrode compassion. Human lives were instruments of strategy. The walls, silent yet omnipresent, bore witness to centuries of suffering. Chains and chambers were more than imprisonment. They were instruments of control that forged obedience, embedded trauma, and left enduring scars on both victims and the medieval world they inhabited. Moonlight spilled across the corridors of the castle, pooling in the shadows like liquid silver. The halls were silent, but not empty. Whispers lingered in the corners, fragments of secrets, confessions never meant to be heard, the residue of sins committed in the name of duty, pleasure, or power. Even after the rituals, the coercion, and the abuses had ended, their echoes remained, threading through generations like invisible chains. Families and courts bore the burden of what could not be named, of shame that could not be absolved, of stories too dark to be recorded openly in chronicles. In hidden chambers, noble descendants whispered cautiously, passing warnings cloaked as advice, lessons born from trauma. A young heiress pressed her palm to a cold stone wall, hearing the faint echo of her mother's sobs from decades past. The touch of ancestral anguish was palpable. Every portrait of a forebear gazed down from gilded frames with judgmental eyes. Every torch cast elongated shadows that seemed to carry the weight of history's secrets. The sins of the past were both curse and inheritance. Religious institutions too bore their complicity. Priests and monks who had once sanctioned or overlooked these acts now murmured penances behind closed doors, their own reputations entwined with the darkness they had tolerated. Secrecy became ritualized, a social currency of survival. A whisper could destroy, an accusation could exile, a memory could haunt. Every family carried both the shame of indulgence and the knowledge that such indulgence was inseparable from power, strategy, and survival in medieval society. The psychological consequences were as enduring as the stone walls themselves. Victims grew into adults burdened by fear and mistrust, their own children raised under the careful guard of caution. Dynasties carried trauma alongside crowns, alliances cemented by necessity but tainted by the legacy of coercion. The halls themselves, polished yet echoing, retained the memory of screams, sighs, and silences, the imprints of human cruelty etched into architecture, the shadows of intimacy and domination cast long across centuries. By chapter's end, the audience sees a society both haunted and sustained by its hidden indulgences. Bizarre sexual practices, once taboo, became woven into the fabric of medieval life, leaving victims and perpetrators alike bound in a legacy of secrecy, shame, and survival. Even in silence, the castle remembered, and those who walked its corridors carried both caution and burden, the whispered legacy of desire and cruelty shaping the generations that followed. The final act of history unfolds in gilded halls and shadowed dungeons alike. Sunlight rarely penetrates the weight of memory. Only torchlight and candle glow illuminate the lingering evidence of desire and cruelty. Here, sexuality and power intersect, leaving marks not only on flesh, but on dynasties, alliances, and societal norms. Every stone, every portrait, every corridor carries the imprint of acts both intimate and violent, the consequences resonating across generations. The audience is drawn into the lives of those shaped by this legacy. A young lord traces his finger along a cold stone balustrade, unaware of the whispered transgressions that secured his family's position. A noblewoman, gazing at the eyes of her ancestors in ornate frames, feels the weight of inherited shame, the invisible lines connecting her to secret ceremonies, coerced acts, and hidden humiliations that once dominated these halls. Desire and cruelty, pleasure and fear continue to define survival in a society structured by hierarchy and repression. Medieval society codified these lessons. Sexual taboos, laws of chastity, and the careful orchestration of consent and observation became instruments of governance as much as morality. Dynasties weakened when desire disrupted alliances. Families endured psychological scars that guided marriages, inheritance, and political strategy. The architecture itself, the dungeons, the hidden chambers, the opulent halls, bore silent witness to these histories. embedding trauma in both body and memory. The climax of reflection comes in the quiet moments. Shadows stretching across stone, floors, ancestral portraits seeming to observe each movement, distant echoes of laughter or pain carried through corridors untouched by time. The audience is left with a moral weight. Human beings possess a boundless capacity for indulgence and cruelty, for domination and survival. Innocence is fragile, desire is powerful, and the architecture of castles and monasteries preserves these truths in whispered stories and historical memory. Ultimately, medieval society emerges as a landscape of contrasts: blood and desire, pleasure and terror, power and vulnerability. The haunting legacy survives, imprinted on both human lives and the stones that sheltered them, a dark testament to the enduring interplay of sexuality, authority, and human frailty. The audience is left with the knowledge that history remembers more than deeds. It remembers their shadows, their whispers, and the inescapable consequences of desire intertwined with power.